Yeah, so today I'm really actually thrilled to have a caregiver to sort of augment what I'm talking about. And so, I've been really interested in terms of caregiving, but also patient experience. And as I was saying, I'm a social worker by trade. So I worked for about 18 years. I started off in adult nephrology, worked at a self-care unit for a number of years. Then I worked in pediatric emergency department, and then I moved into pediatric nephrology. Actually, ironically, I worked with Doug Matzel for a number of years when he was in Ontario. So and Colin White, who will be honored tonight. So it's kind of brings me back a little bit. So for my talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I did. I'm not going to bore you with a big research talk, but I do think my research is really interesting in terms of what it has shown in terms of caregiving. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey, my sort of journey to caregiving, why this is of really interest to me. How many are social workers here? Oh, good. So I'm preaching to the converted. So rest of you nurses, physicians? Nurses? Okay, good. So part of when I think about my research around caregiving, and I'm hoping that that Carol can augment what I'm saying, and probably what she has to say is probably more important than what I have to say, is I hope you come away with this with a sort of a different lens for thinking about caregiving, okay? Because I do bring a bit of a unique lens to it as an academic as well as a clinician. I think that's one of the real joys of my job is I've been able to, I worked for so many years, and then I was able to, and really it was some of these research questions that I had about our patients' experiences that really prodded me to think about a career in academia. I didn't think I'd ever end up in academia. My marks weren't that great, first of all. Anyways, it kind of spurred me on, so you'll see how it kind of worked. So when I think about my research, I always think about it in certain ways. I think about as an academic, what does the research tell us? There's all sorts of studies out there. I'm sure you all read them. Every time something happens, we go to the study. Adira was talking about clinical trials, and all this sort of research really informs the work that we do, which is really important. But I also think our anecdotal and clinical information that we get sometimes doesn't mirror what we see or what we read about. We often read things and then say, oh, well, I know as a social worker, I always think there's always something missing. There's always some sort of context to the studies that I read. So if we read, for example, a study around how, mothers of children with CKD have high levels of depression. I think, okay, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Because there's lots of impact on them, lots of responsibilities, and that it needs to be contextualized. So there's the research part, the anecdotal part, and then there's the patient part, which is it's the patient voice that's really, really important, I think, for the research that I do. And so that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about today. So when we think about the academic side, so what do we know about caregiving? Well, we know that a lot of literature caregiving tells us that the demands of caregiving have a profound effect on caregivers, either dialysis, transplant. Does this have a little starry thing? Oh yeah, there it is. And consistently has shown that, I could list 15 studies. Consistently shown caregivers express depression, anxiety, fatigue, social isolation, relationships, financial strain. All these things have been measured. And so we kind of come away with it with sort of a problem focus, right? That, that there's lots of challenges, and I'm sure Carol will talk about some of the challenges that exist. So even in the literature, they talk about interventions. What are the interventions? Well, education is a big one. If we provide people with education, it gives them a sense of control. Social and practical supports. There's lots of research that talks about the need to provide people with support, not only informal support in terms of peer support, family support, but really around support just generally to help them through. So that's what the literature tells us. So for me, when I started getting near the end of my career, like I'm 90 years old, I was really interested in that my clinical experience, what I was, and some of the social workers here might be able to kind of think about this. What I was experiencing in clinics and what I was experiencing in conversations with the families wasn't really what I was seeing when we were talking about families in rounds, what I was reading about. So how many of us would go to rounds? I'd go to rounds and they'd say, oh, Johnny's doing really well. He's doing really well post-transplant. And then I'd think, okay, yeah, but I just came from Johnny's parents and they're not doing so well, right? And so it really made me start to think about how do we define well? And a lot of the literature, when I started getting into the literature, a lot of the literature was telling us that even when children do well from a quality of life perspective, parents and families are still kind of struggling. They're still challenged by the illness. So if it's dialysis, we know the challenges associated with dialysis in terms of travel, in terms of the children not feeling well between dialysis, and even with transplant. Even when children are transplanted, the literature will tell us that the families say, yeah, but we're just trading one stress for another stress. Okay, and so what I wanted to find out in my study was to find out what were we missing here? What were the pieces of this experience, especially with transplant families, when we can say our kids are doing really well? And I can speak for the clinic that I'm in London, the Children's Hospital. Our kids do really well from a biomedical perspective. So their creatines are good, their grafts are good. Not all the kids are reintegrated into school, but the parents continue to really struggle emotionally, socially. And so I wanted to know more about that. So I did a phenomenological studies. Everybody remembers the research methods days. Phenomenology is the study of meaning making. So what do people attach to their role as caregivers? And so what I did is I went out and I interviewed 12 moms who were, 10 moms, sorry, who were caregivers of children who had been transplanted and children who were doing well, okay? One of the great things, and as social workers, again, you appreciate this, is some of these moms I had known for a number of years, so 14, 15 years. Made it a little bit difficult for me to get my ethics through, but I finally got it through. So for me as a social worker, it was really fascinating to sit in these and it was women, sit in their kitchens and have conversations with them about what their experience was like. So my study is entitled, it's not going to say it's suffering, we're going to say it's an experience, and that was a quote from one of my moms. So what did I find that's pertinent for you today? Well, there was a number of different findings. The three most significant findings were the importance of relationships, and I'll talk about each one of these. Peers, healthcare team, the role of uncertainty in caregiving, and then the development of strengths and personal growth, okay? And I'll kind of go through each one of these just quickly. Can I do the live poll? Can they do it? Or do you want to just skip it? Can you do it?
Are you guys pulled out?
Are you pulled out? I mean, I could just do a show of hands. Would that be easier? We'll do a show of hands. Okay, so what relationship do you think is the most challenging for caregivers to manage? How many people think extended family? Okay, maybe it's just my extended family then. Healthcare team? The patient themselves? Friends? Or other? Whoever other is. So what do you think? How many people think it's B? Okay. So one of the most difficult relationships for families, well, I'll just talk quickly. Relationships are really important to the caregivers. The relationships for obvious reasons, right? Relationships provide a second pair of hands, another set of ears, a good set of ears. Like people say, it's nice to have somebody there I can talk to. People really relied on other people to provide them with support. One of the really interesting things from a social work perspective is that how the caregivers really saw their relationships with other people as a barometer for how they saw themselves. So if, one of the really interesting things that came from this is how many times when I went through the transcripts that I did of the interviews, and I did long interviews, so some of my interviews were over 2 hours long, how many times the moms used the word normal. So I did you can do a thing through in vivo, it's like a count, 130 times in my transcripts the word normal was used, which I thought was really interesting. It's an article I'd like to get back to read, and how many times they talked about their own lives as not being normal, they themselves not being normal, saying that they weren't coping normally, that their child wasn't normal, that their life wasn't normal. And as I always say to my students, always when you hear that kind of language, I always want to ask, what is normal? Right? I'm a big believer that the caregiving experience is not homogenous, that everybody experiences it differently. And my study was proof of that each of these moms, they were challenged in different ways. And to paintbrush them as sort of dealing with things this way, of being sad this way, or dealing with things in stages just didn't work. So really the relationships with other people really were indicative of how they coped and how they managed. If they felt people weren't supportive, it didn't help their social emotional state. Okay? If they would surround themselves with supportive people, as we know, they tended to do better. The most challenging relationship they experienced, healthcare professionals. It was the greatest source of tension for them. It was a tension because they really relied on us to provide them with support, right? But in some circumstances, and again, you can't generalize my study, but it's very transferable. Across the board, they would tell me stories of increased stress. And most of the tension was around their knowledge. So a lot of these moms were at home doing all like yeoman's work. They were doing, some of them had done dialysis, even though their kids were transplanted. They were giving their kids EPO. They were managing, they were problem solving PD. Some of them lived 2 hours away from the center. They were doing all these things. And then when they come into the hospital, they felt like their knowledge was really subjugated. The people weren't really listening to them. People would say, yeah, I know you're the mother, but I'm a doctor, or I'm a nurse, or I'm a physio. And they really felt that, and so for a lot of them, they didn't want to go into hospital. Hospital was not a place, and we would think they don't want to go there because their child's sick. Oftentimes they said, when I went to the hospital, I felt like nobody listened to me and I had no control. And it really, really impacted them. And some of the stories were really interesting. So just in terms of relationships, one of the clinical implications is to really ensure that we're giving caregivers a voice, and not just sort of a party line voice, but that we're really hearing them and we're really listening to what because often the kids that I work with, the parents know the kids better. So again, it's that finding that happy medium where you work along with parents and you give them a voice, but really give them a voice and not just in some sort of token way. So this is the next poll question. I personally enjoy the feeling of uncertainty in my life. Most of the time, some of the time, never, or hate it more than you know. How many of us like to feel uncertain? No, nobody likes to feel uncertain, right? Uncertainty as human beings, and again, the literature talks a lot about uncertainty, doesn't go real well with being a human being. So one of the big issues and again, these were parents of kids with transplants, was uncertainty. So uncertainty and fear of rejection. Well, fear of rejection for sure. We can understand that once that organ fails, and for a lot of the moms that I had, most of them had been, other than I think one, had been on dialysis. And so that's another whole discussion about how dialysis wasn't a thing. It was something they really feared going back to, just for the pure reason of the intrusion into their life. Many of them had to travel. Many of them just found the stress, and their children never did well on dialysis, never felt well. So transplant definitely gave them a better quality of life. So their whole experience of transplant was really based on trying to keep dialysis at bay, keep it on the other side of the door so they didn't have to deal with it. But it was the uncertainty was a significant element of their experience. They talked about never knowing what was around the corner. And so it was small things like coming to clinic. How many of us go to clinic and you don't really think about it? You think, mom and her daughter or mom and her son are coming to clinic, or the family's coming to clinic. And some of the stories they would tell me about clinic. So the one mom said to me, she said, Andrew, she was terrified every time she had to go to clinic. And her son was doing really well. And she said, I would sit in the clinic room, and she said, I would watch the door, and if the physician came in, I'd watch his face to see what his face looked like. She said, now if the physician and the nurse came in, and they weren't looking well, then I got a little nervous that something wasn't right. She said, if the physician, the nurse, and you came in, I knew things were bad. And so, it really was pause for thought in terms of, wow, like how many times we go into clinic rooms, have a brief conversation with people, and then leave. That really, even when they got home, they would go home and wait for that phone call to say, yeah, the blood work's fine, it's not fine. Because they knew that, one phone call, they could end up being in hospital for a month or a couple days. So that sort of uncertainty was really anxiety provoking for them. And so one of my research questions moving forward is sort of this idea of what does that do to people long term, who are, I call it the hamster wheel of dialysis and transplant, that once you get on it, it's hard, you can't get off it. And for these families, uncertainty was huge. And one of the things that made it really difficult, that my sample told me, is that healthcare professionals rarely acknowledged it. That, we know that the transplant is uncertain. We have those conversations in the clinic room, right? When's she going to get called for transplant? Well, we don't really know. So how is she going to respond? How are they going to respond to the cyclosporin? Well, we don't really know. And the mothers would say, even if you don't know, tell us that you don't know, which is really interesting. And if you look at my own theory, and because I'm the one with the microphone, I'll give you my own theory of uncertainty, is that We don't, as health professionals, like uncertainty because that's not the way we're trained. We're trained to know what's going on. You know, especially physicians are trained to you diagnose and you treat. How many of us as social workers have had to almost pull physicians or a nurse practitioner, somebody into the room to talk to a family where they don't have the answers for families? I know my physician, he'd say, oh, I'm not going in there again because I don't know what to tell her. And so what the moms told me was, if you don't know, tell me you don't know. Because it's harder for us if we have to try and seek out the answers and do this little dance or read your face to see, is he lying or are they not lying? And I say that, you know, the parents that I interviewed anyways were almost like kids. What they didn't know, they made up, right? So they would think if the physician's not coming to me, it's because it's not good news. When in fact, that might not even be the case. So there was a real sense of the uncertainty really got to them. So really provide a space to explore the role of uncertainty in patient caregiver day-to-day illness experience. Parents said, let's talk about it. If you don't know when I'm going to be transplanted, just tell me. If you don't know what's going to happen next week, just tell me and give me an opportunity to talk about it as something that's real, okay? And validate the uncertainty is real and ever present. And so that involves us as practitioners being comfortable with not knowing. Right? My social work students, that's their biggest fear when they go into third-year placements, right? They'll always say to me, what if a family asks me something I don't know the answer? Then what do I do? I say, well, here's something novel. Say you don't know, right? And that you'll find out. That nobody expects us to know all the answers. And this is what my family's told me. The mom said, we know you don't know everything, but that's okay. Because at least it makes me feel like we're in this sort of together, rather than you have information that I don't have access to. Or people feeling like I'm not dealing with this uncertainty. And uncertainty comes back in my final slide as well, in terms of what people do with that uncertainty. So which of the following are you least likely to hear from a caregiver? How am I for time? Well, okay. Sometimes I get frustrated with having no time. I get confused with all the medications. This experience has changed me in so many ways. And is it possible to get more in-home supports? Obviously, the answer is C, although the way I phrase that, it could be either or. One of the things that I found that was really surprising to me was, so when I was doing my research, as part of my doctor work, I had to go find a supervisor. And so I was in London at the time, I was still working. And at the university, they set me up with somebody who had a health background, Susan Cadell, and for people, she was at UBC out here for a while. Does a lot of work in post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is this idea that you grow amid very difficult circumstances. And so people said to me, you should go meet Susan. She's great. Your research will line up with hers. And I think, okay, great. So the one day I was supposed to meet with her where the university was an hour from the hospital, and I was at the hospital, and on a pager I was in Emerge. Somebody was rejecting, another family was wanting to stop, and all the rest of it. So I raced to the university. I go see her, walk in her office, and she was the acting director at the time. Beautiful, beautiful office. And so then she starts telling me about post-traumatic growth. I remember thinking, this woman has really lost touch with clinical practice. Like, the people I'm seeing are not growing. There's not a whole lot of growing going on in that Emerge department. There's a whole lot of drowning, people, financially, emotionally, socially, really not doing well. And so she took me on as her student. When I went to do my interviews for this study, I did a first couple hours away from my house. And one of the last questions I would ask the mums was, if you had a room full of people, a room full of mums that were going to go on into this journey, what would you tell them? To a person, they would say, unsolicited, they'd say, you know what, it's been a challenge and it's been really difficult, but I learned so much about myself. For some of them, they had no medical background, but they're giving their kids needles. They were, one mom said, I was standing toe-to-toe with a vascular surgeon at the hospital for sick children, telling him what he was not going to do to my daughter. She said, before that, I would on purpose go by the person at Walmart, give me a cart, because I didn't want to confront them and say I didn't want a cart and hurt their feelings. And she says, now I've learned to advocate for my child. I've learned to speak up. Some of the moms said they found, they were across the board stronger sense of self, right? That they could do more things for their child and for themselves. Enhanced relationships, which there's a big link between post-traumatic growth and people having greater empathy for other people. So these were mums that most of my mums except one had been through dialysis with their child and had been through the transplant process. And they said, I go to the hospital and I see children walking around because our hospital is not that big. I'd see little kids who were going through chemo. And I'd say to myself, thank God my child's not going through chemo. All they had was a kidney transplant. So greater sense of relationships and a greater appreciation for life. And for some, there was spiritual change. So part of managing the uncertainty was also appreciating what they had. So some of them said, I appreciate all my kids more. I appreciate my child who's sick more. I just have a greater appreciation for life. I've actually slowed down and appreciate what I have. It's important to know that growth coexists with the stress and de-stress. And I think even as I was going through my research, this is something I really struggle with. Our families still face a lot of challenges, but amid that, there are opportunities for them to develop skills. And so one of my future projects is to look at how we can use this notion of post-traumatic growth to build capacity for future challenges. Because we know our families are, like I said, again, go through dialysis and transplant, and whether or not the skills that they develop about themselves in terms of providing care for their child or providing care for their adult patient, whether or not they can use those skills for future challenges. And I think emotionally too. So it makes me wonder that there has to be a link around there some way. And again, as the clinical implications are to talk about areas of growth when it seems appropriate. Obviously, you're not going to walk in at times of dialysis and say, wow, you're really growing. But I think there is an opportunity for people to reflect on everything that they've done. And it really, from a social work perspective, it's a strength-based perspective, right? It's identifying for people areas that they have done a lot of things. As human beings, we're sort of wired not to identify our own strengths. Remember, we all go for job interviews, and what's the question we all hate? Tell us some strengths that you have. Everyone hates that question. I'd rather talk about my 50,000 weaknesses than my strengths, right? And so I think for clinical practice, it's the same, is to, at a time and place that's appropriate, is to talk about all the things that our families do, all the challenges that caregivers have been able to mount, and that they've continued on. Because I think building that up, people will start to better believe in themselves. Okay? This was my study, is published, and I've also, I should have put on here, I do have my card if people want me to send you. Dr. Cadell and I just finished actually submitting and got accepted a paper about post-traumatic growth in caregiving in pediatric transplantation. It's in the Journal of Social Work and End of Life and Palliative Care. And also, I did published a paper on uncertainty that was in the Journal of Nephrology Social Work about a year or so ago, if you're interested in those. So one of again, I was saying in terms of my talk, I use this all the time with my adolescent patients that says, our famous Dr. Seuss, that there is no one alive who is youer than you. And I think when we talk about caregiving, I think that's so true. A lot of my adolescent patients say, well, nobody understands me and what I'm going through. And I'd say, you're right, because everybody's so different. So tell us. Tell us what it's like for you as a caregiver. Because I do think they're not a homogenous group. They're all the moms that I interviewed, and it was an absolute privilege to sit in people's kitchens and have conversations about their experiences. And as a social worker, again, these were moms that I knew, and I thought I knew their story, but I learned so much and again, I'd practiced for 18 years and you start to think that you know everything, well, at least I did. And I learned so much about their experience. And my conversations with people changed because of it, in terms of a better understanding of relationships, the importance of them, the uncertainty piece, talking about uncertainty a bit more, and the conversations changed a bit. But I do recognize this does take time. So I will pass it on to Carol. Are we going to do questions after? People have questions?
Yeah, we can do questions after. Just as a quick, linkage with adult care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. A lot of the themes that I identified in my research were consistent with adult literature, right? They were a lot of the uncertainty around transplantation, rejection, and especially the piece around post-traumatic growth. There's been a lot done in adult caregivers around post-traumatic growth, and not so much with pediatrics. So those same elements are there. The only elements that differ with children is the issues around development of the child and dealing with adolescent issues at various developmental stages. But caregivers express very sort of the same issues relative to that, for sure. I can move that.
So Carol is coming from Abbotsford, Chilliwack, even further from Abbotsford. She's the caregiver for her wonderful husband Larry. He's been on peritoneal dialysis, and I understand you're being tested for kidney transplantation as well. So Carol, you can share your story, and then we can have questions afterwards. Are you all set up to go?
I'm not sure I am.
Oh, you can,
Am I on?
yeah, wherever you like.
Can everybody hear me? Good.
Okay.
My husband Larry is diabetic, and he required 2 tests. One was a bone scan, and the other one was for his heart. Both of these tests used contrast dye. We were told he had less than 10% blockage in the top 3 main arteries of his heart. We were happy. We were thinking that was great for a man of 69. We left and went on a trip to Vegas, not knowing my husband was allergic to contrast dye, and he was slowly dying. 3 weeks later, Larry was in the Abbotsford hospital. We were both frantic. We had no idea what was wrong. Larry's blood sugars would not stabilize. We both thought he was dying. It was mid-November 2011. I still remember Dr. Cooper walking into the hospital room. She introduced herself, told us she was a neurologist. Then she put her hand on the bed and asked if it was okay for her to sit down. This simple gesture immediately made the atmosphere different in the room, putting doctor and patient at the same level. She spoke quietly, explaining that Larry's kidneys were operating at 6%. I was shocked. There had never been any problem with his kidneys. Dr. Cooper explained dialysis treatment was necessary, and she talked about the 2 different kinds of treatment my husband would need in order to live. She was pleased that Larry chose the peritoneal dialysis and spent some time with us letting Larry know the steps he would need to start this procedure. Dr. Cooper did everything right. Rather than towering over us, she assessed the situation. There wasn't a chair to sit on, so she asked to sit on the bed. She was calm and quiet. When she finished talking to us, we were excited. Larry was going to live. We would still be able to continue our lifestyle with our motorhome, bowling, square dancing, and holidays to visit our family in Ontario and Texas. We would be starting a different kind of lifestyle, my husband as a PD patient, and myself as his primary caregiver. Peritoneal dialysis was going to become our new household words. I remember thinking as I went home that somehow someone decided that the cavity that houses the organs would be the perfect place to put some sugary liquid to suck out impurities from the body because the kidneys had stopped working. I wanted to hug that person and the parents or grandparents or whoever helped and encouraged, because that person was keeping my husband alive. The next part of my life is a blur. Larry stayed in the hospital and I traveled back and forth each day from Chilliwack to work, then to the hospital for a visit, and back home to Chilliwack. My job? I was already a caregiver for my granddaughter. She was 11 years old, born with a deletion in her chromosome, was non-ambulatory, non-verbal, and classified deafblind. She required 24/7 care. I was her intervener, teaching her communication, and this was just a 5-minute drive from the hospital. When I was introduced to the renal unit on the 4th floor at Abbotsford Hospital, I was impressed with how everyone put their smiles on when they walked through the door. I have trouble doing that, and I really appreciate people who have that skill. It didn't matter how many times we asked the same question, they would patiently explain in layman's terms again. I was taught how to set up Larry's cycler, how to check the solution bags for dates, quantity, and percentage. Everything was taught to both of us. Some stuff wasn't taught to us. Little things that I could see needed to be changed. Little things like making sure the neighbors and family had our door key in case something happened while I was away. When Larry's blood sugar first dropped and he couldn't get out of bed, I wasn't home. We simplified that by installing a combination lock. And there were big things. Things like figuring out where to put all the Baxter boxes we received every month. At first, we put them along the wall in our bedroom, and I quickly tired of having them there, so I moved everything out of the bottom of our double closet. Our clothes now hang on the top rod, and the rest are folded into drawers. Now all the Baxter boxes fit in the bottom of the closet, with the exception of 4 that I can now handle being stored by the wall. It was very convenient having all of the supplies in one room, as opposed to moving Baxter boxes from one area to another every day. I have no idea if there's a form somewhere that says you will receive a minimum of X many boxes each month. They can only be stacked so high, and you will need an area of so many square feet to store them. Would this have helped us? I don't know. What I do know is that I was not prepared for all of the boxes coming into our home each month. Larry was capable of setting up and disconnecting the cycler. I had been shown how to do this, and I thought I knew everything until one day Larry got the flu. It was my turn to be the caregiver, my turn to let my husband know he could trust me to take care of him. It was my turn to set up his machine. What an education that was. I quickly realized that as a caregiver, I needed to pay more attention to everything that was keeping my husband alive. I remember asking if I knew how to set up the cycler on one of our visits to the 4th floor. I had said yes, because I'd watched Larry do it so often. I had only done it once at one of the training sessions we went to. It is important to make sure the caregiver is up to date on everything. I do not fault the staff that was teaching us. I fault myself for assuming I remembered how to do it. Never assume, always be sure. I thought by letting Larry set up, it was keeping his mind sharp, and this was a good thing. We now take turns, both setting up and closing off. There's an old expression from a TV show that we used to watch. The father and son would always say this when everything worked out at the end of the show. We're a team. And Larry and I are a team, working together to make sure that everything is okay. Being a team is a good thing. Working together is also a good thing. I want to talk a little bit about our Baxter orders. We were going on holidays, and I had left the ordering to Larry, and I was taking care of making the list, double-checking everything was in order. We were going away for 7 weeks to Ontario and then to Texas. When we arrived in Ontario, I was sorting the Baxter boxes into the order of how we used them, and noticed we were 2 boxes short. I checked the order form for Texas, and we were also 2 boxes short. After many phone calls and a lot of legwork, Baxter, being the awesome company they are, were able to rectify this so we were able to enjoy our holiday and not go home early. Caregiving is not just about diet, food, and taking meds on time. This is a life support situation, and each step needs to be done properly and thoroughly every time. Now, both my husband and myself are involved in ordering. I will count the inventory and figure out what we need and not tell him. I let him take the inventory, and before he places the order, we exchange notes. We're still a team. Sometimes a caregiver needs to learn how to cook with low potassium and no salt. I did a lot of research to find out about the better choices in Larry's diet. I personally shop on the outside of the store and stay away from the processed, packaged, and canned foods. I find the use of a slow cooker is handy to make many different kinds of meals and then freeze the leftovers. I also make larger meals and freeze the extra for days when I'm too tired. This is one of the easiest ways to save some time, and I think every caregiver should have this information. There are many shortcuts that can be taken in your kitchen. If you have lunches to make, sandwiches freeze. This can be done once a week to save time in the morning, and there's no need to worry. Everything will be thawed by lunch. Take a little time to plan ahead. Makes life easier. On those days when you're running late for an appointment, and our appointments always seem to be around lunchtime, grabbing a few things from the freezer as you go out the door is easy. I found this method keeps you away from the fast food places, and it's wonderful on the budget. I don't recall getting this type of information because I've always done this. I think it was something every caregiver should have the option of knowing. It could be helpful to so many people. Coping with other things besides PD. There was so much going on in the rest of our lives that as a caregiver, I started to slowly feel a drain. After we got into the routine of everyday PD dialysis, other things were happening. In 2013, Larry had an open wound on his foot that wouldn't heal. He had poor circulation from his knees to his toes. In June of 2014, the podiatrist wanted to cut off all his toes. We asked for a second opinion. Thankfully, we were introduced to Dr. Lewis, a vascular surgeon, who ended up saving Larry's foot. And we also started seeing Dr. Schumacher, a podiatrist who worked at the hospital once a week due to the kidney place that I believe they set that up. But slowly, our world started to fall apart. July 2014, our son had a seizure and was diagnosed with a benign brain tumor. In August, our son-in-law's brother committed suicide. In September, our 14-month-old grandson was diagnosed with the beginning stages of autism. In October, I was seriously hurt from a fall in Walmart, and I couldn't walk without the aid of a walker. That same month, our 16-year-old grandson was airlifted via helijet from Chilliwack to Children's Hospital in Vancouver. His VP shunt had stopped working. On October 21st, my son went to the hospital with a really bad headache. The next day, Peter's test showed that the brain tumor was no longer benign. It was aggressive and cancerous. He went into coma, and the following morning, my 35-year-old son, with a 13-month-old baby, died. The day after Peter's funeral, my grandson was again airlifted to Children's Hospital with more complications with this shunt. 6 days later, my son Aaron was married. And in December, my brother-in-law had a seizure and lost the movement of his right side of his body. In 2015, Larry was diagnosed with skin cancer. This was operated on 2 times, and it is now gone. In July, our 3-year-old granddaughter in Texas was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Later that same year, Aletha was diagnosed, my daughter-in-law, with ovarian cancer, the mother of my granddaughter, who was 24/7 care. Aletha died February this year. In between all of this, I had a husband who had many different wounds on his feet. Some healed, some did not. Slowly, he was losing his toes one at a time, and with each surgery, I had no idea if he would lose a toe, a foot, or a leg. The stress was overwhelming. The support I got from the 4th floor was amazing. Every one of Larry's team came in to talk with us when our son died. They were caring and supportive. This is what I needed as a caregiver. The day I couldn't handle it anymore, I had just stopped cooking everything from scratch. I had stopped freezing meals. I had just stopped. I remember Jill, the dietitian, talking to me and encouraging me, giving me some recipes to try. The staff they have on the Renal 4th floor in Abbotsford is pretty awesome. They don't just know their patients, they know their caregivers too. Having a class for caregivers, letting them know what to expect, would be a good thing. Trust is one of the first things we learn as a child, and is the #1 thing in being a caregiver. Our PD patients, being family member or other, need to trust their caregiver. Trust is not instant, it's something that needs to be earned. This trust is developed by the PD patient knowing they can rely and trust the caregiver's judgment, understanding that the caregiver can step in and take proper care of them at any time. Caregivers need to stay healthy. Eat healthy, drink water, exercise, and take some time outs. If you don't take care of yourself, there could be serious consequences. Taking time for yourself is removing yourself from the patient and taking a break. There is a reason why in the airplane they tell you to take the oxygen first and then help others. If you can't breathe, you can't help someone. Being a caregiver also requires a lot of patience. You may ask, how does a caregiver develop patience? Patience is developed by treating your client, be it spouse or otherwise, with the same kind of respect you would want someone to care for you. Is it easy? No. It requires a lot of love, kindness, gentleness, thinking before you open your mouth. But more importantly, it's about listening. All caregivers should be taught this. Life is not easy being a caregiver, but it's a lot easier than being the patient. Thank you for listening.
I got one thing to say about patients. Patients belong in the hospital. But I don't have patience.
Not patience, right? Okay, thank you so much, Andrew and Carol. That was a wonderful presentation. And you can see the interpreting things, because I think as a program, whether we're social work, whether we're nursing, whether we're physicians, regardless of what our roles are, I think we need to really capture not just the patient that's in front of us, but the care providers in their own too. That's something that we can kind of improve on as we go along. Now, are there some questions from the audience for both of our presenters? Or for Larry? Yes.
I just want to ask the caregiver, how are you doing now?
So
I'm
the
doing
question
fine.
was, maybe I'll
Yes.
repeat the question. The question was just, how is Carol doing now as a caregiver?
I'm doing absolutely wonderful. I'm staying on the 24th, 5th floor of this hotel for 2 days. A lot of my training that I had for caregiving, of course, came from the interveners course. I took 3 of them for intervention, and so I learned a lot through that. There is no real training to what I've done with Larry. And part of that was, of course, bandages in his feet, checking them to see, there was a lot more involved in what I was doing with him.
There's a question in the back. Did you ever have anyone come to your house to help out, to prevent any burnout in that, or did you just do it all yourself?
Well, because it's my husband, I'm just starting to realize after 6 years, before that we did everything together, right? So we're still doing everything together. But sometimes now I feel like I need a breakaway. I took a sewing course the other day, and I told the ladies in the sewing course, this was my respite, right? But I do get away, and our faith, we're both Christians, our faith keeps us very strong. Yeah.
Carol, I'm wondering maybe if you can comment. I work in an adult post-transplant clinic, and I'm thinking about the transition for children as they become 19 or 18, depending on where you live, transitioning. And obviously a parent, mom or dad, has to be very involved and needed to be, particularly for young, but in terms of them being the caregiver and now coming to an adult clinic where the child is now the patient and everything is addressed to that child, how we can support the role the mom or dad has been playing and include them, but at the same time help with that transition to independence ultimately for the, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, there's been a lot of work lately, I would say the last 5 years in that, not just in renal, but I know in cystic fibrosis as well. It's a big issue because again, it's very labor intensive for caregivers. And the ideal models are that transitioning happens when they're still in the pediatric clinic. Because one of the other issues is that pediatrics, we tend to coddle our kids. There's big T, there's child life, psychology, and our place. And then when they go to the adult center, there's not so many resources, right? And so the patients feel that, but so do the families. So the families feel like, oh, I have to go because there's not all these other people. So the ideal model is that you support those parents and you have those discussions earlier when the child is still in the pediatric center. I know in London anyways, there's a whole transition program now where they start off talking about issues of sexuality without the mom in the room, and that or the mom and dad in the room. So they just generally try and do that. But even at the end of it, I haven't seen these studies that talk about that, but talking anecdotally with parents, that's really difficult. They've been doing it their whole life, right? And then to be able to hand over the reins and we know that developmentally those kids aren't on par with their sort of normal cohorts emotionally, socially, because their lives have been different. So I think again it's a case by case, but starting earlier gives you better outcomes later.
To prepare both the child
and the parent, yeah.
Change.
Yeah, and start with having in our clinic we started when we were like 14. Let's have mom and dad can be in the room, but then let's have an opportunity for the child if they want. But oftentimes what you find out is the child doesn't want the parents to leave, right? And so it's then preparing them and this whole idea around self-care. Because we know that the more self-care they, taking their own blood pressures, monitoring their own medications, ordering their own medications and stuff, that when they get into adulthood, they're more suited to that. Because what happens is I think we kind of set the kids up to fail too, because we do all this for them, then they get to the adult team has a very different focus. I used to get calls all the time from my adult counterpart social workers saying, God, this kid doesn't do anything for themselves. Yeah, because we do it all for them, right? And so we kind of set them up too. But yeah, earlier you can do it, the better, for sure.
Can I add on that? Yes, I work so much for pediatrics.
Can you talk a little bit louder?
Okay. I said I want to add on that because I also work for pediatrics. In our hospital, we start kids at the age of 12. And sometimes when all the time, when we have cleaning, the dietitian will go in, the pharmacist will go in, the social worker will go in. They will talk to the parents, but also find out from the child if they know their medication. And then we also start educating them that if you reach 19, mom will not be cold. So this transition, we start very early. And sometimes if we know we have a issue, we have a child that really is going to transition into the adult and needs more help, sometimes social workers call the adult, our nurses also go to the station to help that child transition into adult. So yes, work is being done on that. And we also have apps, we also have, books that they can go through. So this is being done because we know when they go to adults, for them to succeed is the way they have to work in when they were in pediatrics.
I
still
think,
have issues that some might not, but we try.
yeah, and I think that's an area that, you know, in our BCKD days, I think we've also had presentations on is that transitioning, even though like great work is being done at BC Children's Hospital, sometimes it doesn't necessarily transition into the adult program when we encounter them from our area, but that needs a lot of work for sure.
Well, I was also thinking about the caregiver more, because the parent has been very involved, and so they're making a transition and kind of releasing, but how to support them in that change as well once they're at our clinic.
And it's funny.
To be respectful of the role they play.
It was about half of my sample and other conversations I've had. One of the things the moms would say is that I'd like sometime, and maybe Carol can talk about this, I'd like somebody to ask me how I'm doing, separate from my patient or my husband or my wife or my child, because I'm a person too. So I think they feel that for sure in the transitioning period, that all of a sudden they're there and we're all focused on the patient, which we should be. But say it'd be nice if someone asked me, how are you doing? Independent of all of this. Right? And the piece is really, you know, the piece where you say you're taking classes in here, which is really great, but a lot of caregivers have guilt about doing that stuff, right? About doing stuff for themselves.
Could I comment on that just
Yeah.
for a minute? Only because this is affecting my life right now. My daughter, my oldest daughter, gave birth to twins at 26 weeks. Both of these boys are now adults, and they are cerebral palsy. They do not have very good muscle, fine muscle control. There's various things wrong with them, but they appear what we call normal. They can't have a job like you can have. It's hard for them to write. One of the boys wears a splint, so on and so forth. And what my daughter did when this transition period came, when they were 14 and 15, she went to the doctor's office with them in the room, and she didn't talk to the doctor. She let the child talk to the doctor. And then, when they were all finished, she would say to the child, do you have anything else to ask or any other questions? And when they said no, she said, well, she would ask her question, but she would ask it through the child, so the child was thinking, gee, I didn't think of that or whatever. And that's how she made the transition. Both of these boys were capable. My granddaughter, who I intervened for, is nonverbal. There's no way she could ever make that type. But if they have certain things working for them, that would be the suggestion is that the doctor talks to the patient and then talks to the caregiver. I had that sometimes where they're not looking at Larry, they're looking at me to answer. I don't answer. It's his body, it's his choice, it's what he wants. Yeah. I just thought I'd throw that because I talked with that about my daughter this morning on the phone. How weird is that?
Larry, did you have any comment as like what you see Carol experiencing? Or
I
what
just
you
want to
see?
get out of the house and leave home. Make a list. A break for everyone.
Amen to that.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, sorry, we just have a couple, few more minutes, then we'll try to go through them.
I just want to say thank you, Carol. I'm a communication myself, and
Hi.
only been in it for about 6.5 years myself, and started when I was diagnosed with a relationship. My family doesn't live here, so it was really taking it upon myself to go in, and Sarah was actually my social worker, so it was a pleasure to meet her, and she was along my whole journey here in the last 6.5 years, and my now husband was also my kidney donor 4 weeks ago. So I'm now transitioning into a new thing, but it's, bringing him in, he knew I was unwell when we met, and he took that on, and, I've been very fortunate to be well most of that time, but, it's a very good insight that as I continue to age, and I hope to have this kidney for a long time, it's working well so far, so hopefully, but, the transition of, how his life will be impacted as we move forward, both as a caregiver, and as a donor. Of course, right now it's looking great and that sort of thing, but it's very insightful to see, you know, all the ups and downs, but also the triumphs that come, and I hope the best for you guys as well as this lovely journey continues.
Yeah. I think Larry will be um, on the list for donors. He's not quite there. It's one more test. But his blood type is one of, not the rarest. I think AB negative is the rarest. His is B negative. So, yeah.
Was there a comment over there? Question?
Yeah, it was just a comment. As a home chemo educator, it just makes me think of sort of my patients at home who come and take on their care themselves of dialysis at home, but we don't meet their partner or their wife or husband or caregiver because they're doing it all themselves, and it just makes me think of how I can, or the social worker, maybe try and reach out to that other person that is part of their team, but is not coming to clinic with them and sharing their experiences. All of
And they may
this.
see different things than you see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's sort of this name, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, because that's a reason why we wanted to kind of have this presentation too. Well, we want to look at the patient, but the patient isn't just the patient, it's the caregivers, whether it's family, friends, extended relatives, that sometimes are so involved, and their health and well-being is really key too to the patient's well-being.
And if you think about it, and we know this has been over and over, anecdotally, whatever, that the patients only do as well as the caregivers. So it's crazy that there's not enough, I don't know about BC, but I know in Ontario, there's just not enough support for families. Like I said, the stuff that our families are doing in their homes is like running many hospitals. And so it's crazy. And we always say to families, well, you know, if the families aren't doing well, you know what, we'll do as much as we can, because if the families don't do well, then if the caregivers don't do well, then the patient, it's going to trickle down to the patient. But I don't know, from a policy, they haven't caught up there yet, right? Like, it's crazy.
Was there one more question around here, and then we'll finish?
Oh, Larry, did you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Sure, okay, thank you. Just wanted to clarify from both of you, if you could give continued words of wisdom how you went about talking to your family and to your friends about your journey in order to receive support from them. We get support from our family in a lot of different ways. Again, I'm talking for Larry, right? Larry's got two girls. This is a second marriage. He has two girls in Ontario that he talks to every day, and they're very supportive. If they don't get, what was that?
He told us that
Yeah.
if it wasn't for Carol, I wouldn't be alive.
Yeah, I love being in the kitchen. Being in the kitchen is easy for me. Doing his diet was challenging, and making taco spices, because what you buy has got 23% salt. That all came easy to me. But getting support, I understand what getting support from your family is, because we get that. We have my son, who's now lost his wife and has a 24/7 care child, that doesn't get support because people don't want to be around a nonverbal child that doesn't respond to them. And I see there where he really needs time away. He really needs some one-on-one with somebody else. And this situation we have with us, Larry can do most of it. I have not given him a needle. I know I could, but I've not done that. I feel the more he does, the better it is. But I am totally capable. I've done the things in antibiotics into his bags and a variety of things that we work together at doing. It doesn't affect our social life like it can on other people where they're overwhelmed, because Larry can do things. It's when they can't do things, when all of the responsibility is yours. And I see that we have 16 grandchildren. 8 of them are not what you say is normal. 8. And the worst one, I think, would be my son, because people don't want to be in a room with somebody who's making sounds, verbal sounds, and not words, right? So I understand what you're saying. We see it from all different aspects. I'm very supportive of my son. Besides what I do here, I still go there on Sundays to give him respite. That's my respite, being with her.
I phoned us this morning asking if we could go up there tomorrow. So we're in Vancouver.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming to the session. We hope it was insightful. And if you have any other questions, we're here as well. Thank you.